Hello, I'm Mark Galliotti of, amongst other things, the In Moscow Shadows podcast. And what I want to do today is just make a few very specific observations about the now infamous Tucker Carlson-Putin interview. I'm not trying to cover the whole ground, but just a few things that particularly interested me, especially in response to some people saying, it's just a propagandistic narrative, it's not worth watching. Well, as someone who, God help me, did actually end up watching the whole damn thing, had to really. Although I would absolutely agree, I cannot in all conscience tell anyone to watch that monstrously tedious thing. But nonetheless, I would respectfully disagree that it's not worth watching at all. Because yes, it's a dull propagandistic piece of work. But the point is, in some ways, precisely what makes it a bad interview makes it a good or at least interesting source on Putin himself. Because we must remember this, we have so few direct and relatively unmediated opportunities to get a sense of Putin, the man, and what he's thinking. And it has to be said that this didn't really come across as something that had been really carefully choreographed and stage managed. I cannot imagine that many media managers had been saying to Putin beforehand, whatever you do, you've got to start with at least 30 minutes essentially narrating simple Russian history textbook stuff. No, of course not. This was just him deciding what he wanted to speak. So we actually saw a relatively unmediated Putin for once. And look, Tucker Carlson, who, let's be perfectly honest, is not a journalist. He's a TV personality and political pundit, shall we say. I suppose we'd actually call him an influencer in the modern age more than anything else. But the point is, he didn't really try to maintain control of the interview. And on one level, I'm sure that was pretty much part of the deal that allowed him to get this. Remember that although he claims that, well, no Western journalists have even tried to get Putin's own take, that's absolute nonsense. And when you're actually fact-checked by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who says, no, that's wrong, there have been lots of other journalists making applications for interviews, you know you're frankly on the wrong side of history. But anyway, it's not just that. I think it's also that Carlson quite quickly realised that he wasn't going to be able to control this. There was this quite entertaining look of dazed horror at times as Putin went on and on and on, as if Tucker Carlson wasn't quite sure if he was in the right interview. And although he did redeem himself slightly towards the end when he was talking about the imprisoned Wall Street journalist Evan Gershkovich, and actually was saying, look, everyone knows he's a hostage, essentially we have to realise that basically Carlson's job was every now and then to feed Putin a new line. Sometimes Putin would use that and then run with it, and often he would just ignore and just run in whatever direction he wanted. But then again, was Carlson really going to be that bullish? I mean, this was his opportunity to make a massive media splash. And the irony is that the more furore there is, the more people are horrified and people saying we should sanction him or whatever. Actually, the more increases his profile. But still, it's not just that. It's also how far do you want to challenge an increasingly erratic authoritarian who has had people killed and who clearly has, shall we say, limited reason to have impulse control these days. So, for all these reasons, I think we did get a pretty unvarnished sense of Putin. And in that context, I think there's four things I would really want to... I don't know why I held up 5 fingers. 4 things that I would really want to say that sort of really came out to me about, again, precisely about Putin the person rather than the specifics he was saying. The first and most obvious, which might sound trivial, is precisely the degree of self-indulgence. Starting with that whole, I need to tell you something about Russian history in 30 seconds to a minute, and then rolling on regardless for 30 minutes, ignoring Carlson's attempts to try and sort of move things forward and such like. And as I say, I mean, to me, that makes it clear that he wasn't interested in getting any pointers from anyone else. He just regarded this as an opportunity. He clearly considers the history as being an absolutely crucial element of contemporary politics. It's ridiculous in many ways. I mean, he is a really bad historian. You know, a lot of the history he raises actually is totally cherry-picked and distorted to provide an especially cosy narrative that justifies his points of view about the fact that Eastern Ukraine is essentially part of Russia, and therefore this is, as he put it later, essentially has some of the characteristics of a civil war. He wants to emphasise this degree of sort of Russian manifest destiny, but manifest destiny often coming from the fact that it's being mistreated by others, and I'll come on to that point later. So, this is a history which tells us a lot, I think, about where Putin is at. Now, I don't think what this means, as some people say, is, oh, well, he wants to revive the Tsarist Empire or revive the Soviet Union or anything like that. No, I mean, he's not quite that simplistic in his approach to history. But nonetheless, it is clear that he regards history as a touchstone for understanding the present world, and therefore when he talks about history, it's worth listening to it, even while we're aware of the distortions, or in some ways especially when we're aware of the distortions, because the distortions tell us, I think, something particularly about his policy goals. And in that respect, look, it's also clear that the self-indulgence manifested in his willingness to lie, flat out lie, on issues which are very, very clearly fact-checkable. I mean, for example, when he made the point right at the beginning to Tucker Carlson's rather strange sycophantic laughter, that he'd never said that the United States might launch a strike against Russia, when one can actually go back to his own statements and see that he did. So the interesting thing is this: either that says someone who is willing to believe what he finds convenient to believe, in other words, that in his mind, what he's saying is the reality, or it's someone who, precisely being an autocrat, increasingly surrounded by yes-men, just simply never feels the need to worry about saying things that can be corrected because he's not used to anyone doing so. Either way, it gives us a sense of the encapsulation of Putin, the degree to which precisely he is now disconnected, I think, from many of the realities of the world. I'm not saying he's insane or anything like this, but I am saying that this is the sort of classic trajectory of an autocrat, and especially an autocrat who hasn't got a lot of self-knowledge. And I don't think Putin is a particularly self-reflective kind of guy. That precisely he is willing to allow himself to be increasingly cocooned in a comforting bubble of sycophancy and empty agreement. So, yes, I think that very much came through. Secondly, the petty malice that was evident. I mean, there's something about Putin. He really loves putting people down. Even Tucker Carlson, who is giving him a gift in many ways. This opportunity to have an unchallenged propaganda 2-hour broadcast that, because of all the agitation around it, is going to be watched a hell of a lot more than one would usually say, hey, would you like to listen to 2 hours of Putin expounding on his own point of view? But so even though Tucker Carlson is giving him this gift and not really sort of being a particularly heavy-handed or hard-nosed interlocutor, this was not Frost-Nixon. Even then, there was that little sort of jibe about the CIA, which I remember you unsuccessfully tried to apply for in your youth or whatever. He loves those things that show A, I have knowledge of you, and B, I am willing to just snipe you down. Now, on one level, one can say, well, okay, big deal. So Putin is not a nice man. Shock, horror. That is not a kind of a revelation in and of itself. But it was interesting how often we had kind of similar sentiments manifest that basically, if he can put you down, or if anyone can be considered vulnerable, then they deserve what happens to them. For example, Poland. His perspective was basically that Poland was asking to be invaded by the Germans in World War II, and they provoked it. Again, an interesting, lack of self-awareness, again, nothing new, but also just this sense that the world is a hostile, nasty, zero-sum place. And you are constantly in competition with everyone. And if you can't do that, and remember, this is a guy who talks about his own experiences in childhood in the sort of the rough parts of a still semi-rubbled Leningrad, as was then St. Petersburg now, who said that he learned, running with gangs, that if you know you're going to get into a fight, then it's actually worth being the one who throws the first punch. This is it. It's almost as if Putin regards himself as being in a fight with everyone, and therefore wants to throw the first punch at every time. Yes, this is the shallowest pop psych approach to trying to understand a person. But it's something we've seen in so many other different aspects. But I was just struck by how much it came out. This sense of, for all he talked about partners and negotiations and the like, but this sense of a world that is an essentially hostile, unforgiving place, and that you are either predator or you are prey, and you are constantly trying to demonstrate that you're on the predator edge of things, even if you're actually talking to Tucker Carlson in front of a TV camera. Third point, the absolute centrality of the West. Now, on the one hand, Putin has chosen to basically create for himself this image as the champion against a hegemonic, arrogant, bullying, and increasingly also woke collective West. And this is the narrative that we see deployed in the West, narrative deployed in the global South, or as increasingly the Russians are now calling them, the world majority, which is actually quite a clever little angle. But also the narrative deployed at home. The idea that this is not just simply a conflict in Ukraine, that the war is a special military operation against all of the West, in which Ukraine is just the battlefield, and it's a conflict which is not just simply about whether or not NATO can put its missiles or its troops on Ukrainian soil and threaten Russia, but more broadly about Russia's future, Russia's sovereignty, Russia's autonomy, but also Russian values and the survival of what Putin considers to be sort of traditional European values, again, in the sense that the Russians are the true Europeans and it's the European Union and UK and so forth who have lost their way. But in this context, the degree to which he is constantly going back to the fact that the West is being unfair to Russia, that the West is excluding Russia, that the West is cancelling Russia, actually is fascination the right word? I think it probably is. This fascination or almost obsession with being validated by the West is really very striking. Keeps complaining about how the West is nasty to him and nasty to Russia and so forth. He desperately wants that. China, you remember the country with whom they have Russia has a friendship with no limits. China scarcely gets mentioned. And when it does get mentioned, it's only mentioned in the context of the fact that the West is even more worried about China than it is about Russia because China is bigger and so forth. There's no sense of a proud sovereign Eurasian entity in Russia. I mean, this is the notional idea is that, yes, Russia stands alone. It is itself a civilization. No, actually, what really comes out so clearly is this desperation that Putin has, which is one that, to a degree, is shared, I think, across Russian society, but it's just very, very striking here. This desperation precisely to be accepted and validated by the West, but not limited. So in other words, it's not like he thinks, well, look, I want the West to think that we're good, and therefore we will conform to their ideas and their values and their morals and so forth. No, it's, we still want to do our own thing, but we want you to tell us that it's all right. It's a very immature, juvenile or whatever perspective. And again, a man with a bit more self-confidence. This is the irony. I think actually Putin is in many ways, for all he likes to preserve this veneer of the aloof master of all he surveys, I think actually Putin is a deeply insecure man. Again, more pop psych. But for all that, I mean, again, the insecurity and the fact that Russians still consider themselves to be Europeans, and the fact that the isolation, the separation, the distinction, and the degree to which Europe is now arrayed against it does actually sting, I think came through very much. So ignore a lot of the stuff about we don't need the West, we don't need Europe and so forth, we're fine. Actually, sure, the economy may still be operating after a fashion, etc. But here, I don't think so. And that leads me to the final point, which again, it's an interesting irony for a man who has built so much of his personal narrative, his personal, God help me, I'll use the word brand, around precisely being this world-shaking, sort of bestriding colossus, is actually the lack of agency for himself and for Russia that he implies at every turn. Bill Clinton said we could perhaps join NATO, and then he turned around and said we couldn't. The Revolution of Dignity was a CIA plot in a country that, by Putin's own narrative, is really a semi-detached part of Russia, but there was still basically apparently nothing Moscow could do about it. The war on the Donbass, no, that was started by the Ukrainians. We just had to respond to them. Time and time again, he presents Russia as clearly a victim of a hostile conspiratorial West, as well as of events, and essentially having to just simply respond to that. Now, on one level, one could say that this is just simply a useful political narrative, that you want to say, actually, we're on the defence. But after a certain point, when it becomes such a pervasive theme, the degree to which Putin is constantly laying out this rich and varied buffet of grievances and just deciding which of them to pick on in this particular moment, I think it becomes clear that there's something more than that. This is the irony. Putin's acute victimology, his desire to constantly present himself and Russia as the victims of others, conceals within it a sense actually that Russia has strikingly few real options. And again, you might think, well, Russia is still a large, powerful country. It has options. It could just opt to pull out of Ukraine tomorrow. It could do all kinds of other things. Well, in theory, yes. But I'm not entirely sure that Putin feels that way. I mean, he rolled into Ukraine and now he's stuck in this war. A war that has had horrific costs for Russia, domestically, internationally, economically, politically, you name it. You know, how far can he just simply abandon those sunk costs? He couldn't really turn around tomorrow and say, actually, we're going to pull out of Ukraine. It was worth a try, but it didn't pan out, and frankly, we don't think we're going to get much more. So we'll pull back. We'll keep Crimea, obviously, but basically we'll give up. Of course, he couldn't do that, both psychologically as well as politically. Now, I think he has more options than he believes. Again, I think he's scared enough that he actually has artificially limited his range of options. But time and time again, what this tells us is actually not only is Putin actually honest for Putin when he presents this very sort of defensive narrative, that he actually does believe that Russia is under threat and all his regime is under threat, but I don't think he frankly distinguishes between Russia and his regime. L'État c'est moi. In his case, Russia is me. But beyond that, I think genuinely this is a man who does feel that actually his agency is much more constrained than we might assume. And in some ways that helps explain why he tries to project this narrative as the man who is the Grand Master shaping the whole game. But instead, he reacts with the spiteful and fearful instincts of a victim, or indeed of that gangly and yet aggressive teenager who on the streets of Leningrad constantly feels under threat and therefore is, as he was, constantly getting into scraps, probably because he felt that he had no option but to strike that first blow. So a lot of this, as I say, is very much the shallowest of attempts to try and actually read into Putin himself, rather than to unpick the wider questions of what was the messages being sent to the Americans, or how far did this play into Trumpian narratives or the like. There are other places to be discussing that. This was just my kind of considered thinking about what I read of Putin, and trying desperately to find some kind of virtue out of having spent 2 hours of my life watching this, as I say, phenomenally tedious, quote-unquote, interview.